My greedy husband and his father secretly sold my award-winning vineyard, so I faked a massive federal quarantine and let them destroy their own lives. I'm 35 years old, and my entire existence is rooted in the soil, the seasons, and the incredibly delicate science of viticulture. I'm a master winemaker. When my grandmother passed away exactly 7 years ago, she bequeathed me the absolute pride of our family, a sprawling 75-acre heritage vineyard nestled in one of the most prestigious wine valleys in the world. The estate is not merely a farm. It produces a highly exclusive, globally acclaimed vintage. According to the most recent agricultural appraisal, the pristine land, the state-of-the-art fermentation facilities, and the mature vines carry a combined valuation of exactly $8,500,000. My husband, Simon, possessed absolutely zero respect for the land. Simon was a luxury car salesman whose entire personality revolved around projecting unearned wealth. He despised the dirt, the grueling harvest hours, and the quiet isolation of the valley. He constantly pressured me to liquidate the estate so we could move to a massive coastal penthouse and live like royalty. Encouraging his delusions was his father, Arthur. Arthur was a ruthlessly arrogant, completely bankrupt commercial real estate speculator who had lost his fortune through incredibly shady investments. Arthur looked at my heritage vineyard and saw nothing but a massive, unexploited piggy bank. I told them both, drawing an absolute immovable boundary, that the estate was my legacy and it was permanently off the market. I believed my final word on the matter was respected. I was profoundly, catastrophically wrong. Exactly 3 weeks ago, I flew to Florence, Italy, to attend a highly exclusive 12-day summit on global viticulture. Because the European summit was incredibly demanding, I left Simon in charge of managing the basic estate payroll while I was abroad. The conference concluded a full 48 hours ahead of schedule. Exhausted but eager to sleep in my own bed, I rebooked my flight, landed under the cover of night, and took a quiet car service directly back to the Valley estate. Simon was not home. His luxury vehicle was gone. I walked into our sprawling farmhouse, poured myself a glass of water, and went into the home office to drop off my travel documents. Simon had left his heavy mahogany desk unlocked. Sitting right in the center of the leather blotter was a thick, professionally bound legal dossier bearing the embossed logo of a massive multinational beverage conglomerate. I opened the heavy cover, and the sheer breathtaking audacity of their betrayal completely paralyzed my lungs. Simon and Arthur had not just plotted behind my back. They had meticulously orchestrated a stunningly illegal corporate acquisition. Arthur had utilized his sleazy real estate connections to hire a corrupt notary, entirely forging my signature on a massive agricultural proxy transfer. They had legally authorized the complete sale of my 75-acre estate, including the priceless underground water rights, directly to the corporate conglomerate. But the final addendum of the contract revealed the absolute depths of their sociopathic greed. Because the conglomerate was desperate to acquire the highly acclaimed terroir, they had wired an immediate non-refundable cash advance of exactly $1,200,000 to secure the contract. Simon and Arthur had routed every single penny of that advance directly into a highly secretive offshore shell account registered exclusively in Arthur's name. They had stolen my grandmother's legacy. They forged federal land deeds, completely bypassed my sole ownership, and pocketed over $1 million in stolen cash. The timeline on the paperwork indicated that the conglomerate's bulldozers were scheduled to arrive and completely uproot my heritage vines the exact week I was supposed to return from Italy. I stood in the silent farmhouse, staring at the forged proxy. They assumed I was just a simple farmer who would be too intimidated by the massive corporate lawyers to put up a fight. They thought they had executed an entirely flawless, untraceable land heist. My shock evaporated entirely, replaced by a brutally cold, calculating wrath. I did not smash the desk. I did not call the local sheriff. I meticulously photographed every single page of the forged acquisition, the offshore routing numbers, and the corrupt notary's official stamp. I placed the dossier exactly where I found it, entirely undisturbed. I packed a small canvas bag, walked out the front door, and checked into a quiet, secluded bed and breakfast on the opposite side of the valley. I was not going to entangle my pristine vineyard in a massive, multi-year civil litigation nightmare. I was going to construct a psychological trap so horrifying that they would willingly, desperately empty their own pockets to reverse the theft entirely on their own. When you dedicate your life to the slow, meticulous fermentation of fine wine, you understand the absolute necessity of patience. You do not force the process. You carefully control the environment, seal the barrel, and let the underlying chemistry do the devastating work for you. I did not immediately storm back to the farmhouse to scream at my treacherous husband. I spent 2 entire days sequestered in my quiet bed and breakfast, systematically drafting his ultimate ruin. On Wednesday morning, I scheduled an emergency consultation with an elite agricultural land use attorney, a fiercely intimidating man who charged exactly $900 an hour. I laid the high-resolution photographs of the forged proxy transfer and the offshore banking details across his massive oak desk. He adjusted his spectacles, read through the fraudulent real estate contract, and let out a long, heavy sigh. He informed me that Simon and Arthur had orchestrated a staggering array of federal crimes. By forging a proxy to liquidate a multi-million-dollar agricultural estate and routing a corporate cash advance overseas, they had committed massive wire fraud, grand larceny, and felony deed forgery. My attorney reached for his desk phone, offering to have the federal authorities arrest my husband at our farmhouse before the afternoon was over. I gently placed my hand over his phone, shaking my head. I explained that a messy federal raid would result in my pristine vineyard being locked inside a sprawling multi-year probate investigation, while corporate lawyers fought over the water rights. I did not want my land trapped in legal purgatory. I wanted my husband to willingly, frantically rip up his own stolen contract. I wanted to watch his arrogant father's unearned ego completely shatter into a million pieces. My attorney listened to my strategy, a slow, incredibly dark smile spreading across his face. He called it an absolute masterpiece of psychological warfare. Because I manage a highly regulated commercial farm, I am deeply familiar with the terrifying labyrinthine regulations of the United States Department of Agriculture and the Environmental Protection Agency. I know exactly what their classified indictments look like, complete with the heavy green government seals and the uncompromising, apocalyptic legal phrasing used to crush environmental violators. I returned to my rented room, opened my laptop, and spent exactly 10 uninterrupted hours drafting a flawless 90-page classified federal agricultural quarantine mandate. The fabricated document outlined a catastrophic ecological crisis. It claimed that deep soil testing had just revealed a massive, highly unstable deposit of lethal, synthetic industrial pesticides buried beneath the water table in the 1950s. The document declared that the entire 75-acre terroir was fundamentally poisoned, rendering the grapes highly toxic and declaring the land a permanent condemned biological dead zone. But the absolute lethal poison was buried directly on page 9. I drafted a highly specific clause stating that any individual who currently held the active legal proxy to the estate or who had recently accepted commercial funds to sell the contaminated land was immediately classified as a distributor of lethal biohazards. The fake mandate explicitly stated that the Environmental Protection Agency was issuing an immediate, undischargeable ecological restitution fine of exactly $45 million against the legal signatories. Furthermore, it declared that anyone attached to that specific $1,200,000 cash advance would face a mandatory minimum sentence of exactly 60 years in a federal penitentiary for massive interstate agricultural fraud. It was an inescapable, profoundly terrifying snare. I printed the massive stack of paper, bound it in a heavy crimson government classification folder, and initiated the performance. On Thursday evening, exactly when the sun was setting over the valley, I arrived at our farmhouse. I had deliberately smeared dark topsoil onto my jeans, rubbed dust into my hair, and forced my eyes to remain wide and intensely frantic. I unlocked the front door. Simon was sitting on the leather sofa, sipping an expensive glass of imported wine, entirely prepared to play the role of the loving, unsuspecting husband, welcoming his wife home from Europe. I did not even look at him. I stumbled into the living room, let the heavy crimson folder crash onto the coffee table, and collapsed into my armchair, burying my face in my trembling hands. Simon set his wine down, his brow furrowing in irritation. He asked me what on earth was wrong. Simon, I whispered, letting a fake, agonizing sob completely wreck my voice. The vineyard is gone. The legacy is entirely destroyed. His confident posture stiffened. He casually asked what I meant, feigning complete innocence. I looked up at him, forcing my expression into a mask of pure terror. I told him that federal agricultural agents had just intercepted me at the county line. I told him they had completely seized the 75-acre estate because a massive lethal pesticide leak had poisoned the entire aquifer. Simon blinked rapidly, entirely unable to process the scale of the fabrication. And then, I unleashed the final devastating blow. The most horrifying part, I gasped, clutching my chest, is the massive environmental liability. The federal agents told me that whoever legally holds the proxy to this land and accepted commercial money for it is going to be permanently ruined. They are issuing a mandatory cleanup fine of exactly $45 million, and because the government thinks I still hold the deed, the federal prosecutors are going to send me to a penitentiary for 60 entire years. I watched the realization strike him with the force of a runaway tractor. The blood entirely drained from his face. His skin turned the color of wet ash. He realized in that exact horrifying fraction of a second that he and his father had voluntarily forged a legal proxy to transfer a condemned biological dead zone directly into their own control. He realized that by pocketing that $1,200,000 cash advance, he had just legally signed himself up for 60 years in federal prison as an environmental terrorist. He did not rush to my side. He did not offer a single word of comfort. He stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a heavy floor lamp. He muttered that his chest was tight and he needed a glass of water immediately. He practically sprinted down the hallway, slammed the heavy wooden door to the guest bathroom, and threw the deadbolt. I stood up from the armchair, my manufactured tears vanishing instantly. I walked silently across the hardwood floor and pressed my ear against the painted wood. Simon was hyperventilating so violently, he was practically choking. He had immediately dialed Arthur. "Dad, we are completely dead," Simon hissed, his voice cracking with absolute panic. "The federal government seized the vineyard. The land is lethally poisoned. The Environmental Protection Agency is charging the proxy holder $45 million for the cleanup. If the corporate conglomerate traces that $1,200,000 wire transfer to your offshore account, we are both going to federal prison for 60 years. We have to rip up the acquisition. We have to wire the entire sum of money back to the corporation right this exact second." I stood in the dim shadows of the corridor, a completely cold, satisfied smile spreading across my face. The snare was set. The terror was absolute, and they were about to willingly, frantically tear their own fraudulent empire entirely to shreds. I remained entirely motionless in the dimly lit hallway, absorbing the magnificent symphony of sheer panic echoing through the heavy wooden door. Inside the guest bathroom, Simon and his arrogant father were completely disintegrating. Simon was hyperventilating, frantically echoing the entirely fabricated, apocalyptic ecological sanctions I had just delivered. He kept choking on his words, weeping about spending 60 years in a federal penitentiary and owing the Environmental Protection Agency $45 million for biological contamination. After allowing them to marinate in their absolute terror for exactly 15 minutes, I retreated silently to the living room. I sank back into my armchair, buried my face in my hands, and seamlessly re-entered the character of the devastated, helpless winemaker. The bathroom door finally creaked open. Simon emerged looking like a hollowed-out shell of the smug luxury salesman he had been an hour prior. His crisp designer shirt was soaked through with cold sweat, his complexion was a sickly, pale yellow, and his hands trembled so violently he could scarcely hold on to his cell phone. He crossed the room, dropped heavily onto his knees beside my chair, and reached out to grasp my wrists. His palms were incredibly clammy. He looked directly into my eyes and he delivered the most remarkably desperate, poorly constructed lie I had ever been forced to endure. "My love," he rasped, his voice cracking horribly. "I must confess something to you. I did something incredibly foolish exactly 3 weeks ago, but I only did it because a commercial developer told me it would secure our financial future forever." I widened my tear-filled eyes, playing the role of the profoundly confused spouse. He took a massive, shuddering breath and continued his pathetic fabrication. He claimed he had been deeply concerned about the volatile agricultural market. He swore he wanted to surprise me by leasing the underground water rights to a massive conglomerate to establish a permanent, multi-million-dollar trust fund in my name. And then he confessed to the actual federal felony, attempting to disguise it as an act of profound devotion. I forged your signature on a proxy transfer to sell the estate. He wept, his fingers digging into my wrists. We accepted a $1,200,000 cash advance from the beverage conglomerate. I was merely trying to build your empire. But now, the federal government has my father and me listed as the primary financial proxies for a condemned biological dead zone. I violently wrenched my wrists out of his grip. I stood up, towering over his pathetic kneeling form, and unleashed a masterclass in theatrical devastation. I began pacing the living room, tearing at my hair. I shouted that he had committed a catastrophic act of federal environmental fraud. I told him that because he had accepted a massive corporate wire for lethally poisoned land, the federal prosecutors were going to arrest him and his father for distributing biological hazards before the morning even broke. Simon entirely shattered. He curled into a fetal position on our expensive rug, sobbing hysterically. We must reverse the acquisition. Simon shrieked, looking up at me with sheer unadulterated terror. My father is driving to his sleazy real estate lawyer right this exact second. We have to wire the entire sum of money back to the conglomerate and dissolve the forged proxy before the federal investigators trace the offshore accounts. Exactly 30 minutes later, the front door to our farmhouse flew open. Arthur rushed inside. The smug, elite real estate speculator was completely gone. In his place was a pale, hyperventilating mess of an old man, sweating profusely through his bespoke suit and clutching a heavy leather portfolio to his chest like a shield. He bypassed any formal greetings, entirely ignoring me to scream directly at his son. We must invalidate this land sale immediately. Arthur roared, his voice shrill with panic. I'm not going down for a massive federal ecological disaster. I'm not spending 60 years in a federal penitentiary because you sold a poisoned vineyard. I simply nodded, maintaining my facade of utter hopelessness. I informed them that if they did not completely reverse the massive cash advance and legally revoke the fraudulent land proxy within the hour, the federal authorities would permanently freeze every single asset attached to their names to pay for the municipal cleanup. Arthur nearly collapsed. He pulled out his phone, dialed his high-risk offshore banking concierge on the emergency after-hours line, and frantically authorized an immediate international wire reversal back to the beverage conglomerate. I stood in my living room and listened as Arthur completely drained his secretive offshore account. Because emergency commercial wire reversals of that magnitude carry astronomical, percentage-based penalty fees, Arthur willingly sacrificed exactly $110,000 of his own remaining liquidity just to return the $1,200,000 to the corporation. He completely decimated his own financial safety net out of sheer, suffocating terror. I told them we needed to leave for the corrupt real estate lawyer's office entirely immediately. We drove in separate cars. I followed closely behind Arthur's luxury sedan, watching in my rearview mirror as he drove recklessly through the winding valley roads, utterly desperate to shed the massive federal liability. We arrived at the discreet, unmarked commercial law office exactly 45 minutes later. Arthur's corrupt attorney looked absolutely terrified when the old man burst through the doors and slammed his portfolio onto the glass desk. Arthur demanded that the lawyer print a massive, legally binding document entirely revoking the forged proxy and completely removing his holding company from the acquisition contract. Because the massive funds had already cleared the international wire reversal, the sleazy lawyer did not dare argue. He saw the pure, unhinged panic in Arthur and Simon's eyes, and he produced the legal revocation documents immediately. Arthur and Simon did not even bother to read the dense stack of legal parchment. Their hands trembled so violently they could barely grip the heavy fountain pens. They were entirely convinced that federal hazardous materials teams were going to kick down the doors at any passing second. They signed their names rapidly. They legally, officially dissolved the entire massive land sale. They completely surrendered any and all financial claims to the Heritage Vineyard, effectively returning the estate, the water rights, and the absolute legal ownership entirely into my sole name. The corrupt lawyer stamped the documents with his heavy brass seal, officially validating the complete reversal. I reached across the desk and picked up the heavy legal folder containing the freshly signed revocation documents. I inspected the fresh ink. I felt the physical weight of the folder in my hands. My priceless agricultural legacy was completely, entirely mine again. No forged proxies. No corporate bulldozers. I slowly tucked the heavy folder securely under my arm. And then, the entire atmosphere in the sleazy law office completely, instantly shifted. I stopped looking like a terrified, broken farmer. I squared my shoulders, entirely dropping the frantic panic breathing. I stood up perfectly straight, completely smoothed the wrinkles from my clothes, and looked down at my entirely treacherous husband and his completely ruined father. I just smiled. A completely cold, entirely merciless smile. And then, I dropped the absolute, final hammer on their entirely fabricated reality. I stood up perfectly straight, methodically brushed the imaginary dust from my denim jeans, and looked down at my entirely treacherous husband and his profoundly ruined father. I just smiled. A chilling, entirely merciless smile. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere inside that sleazy commercial law office shifted in a single, staggering heartbeat. I no longer resembled a terrified, broken winemaker teetering on the edge of a nervous collapse. I squared my shoulders. I steadied my breathing. The pathetic, weeping facade was officially dropped. Simon looked up at me from the cheap leather guest chair. His bloodshot, tear-stained eyes narrowed just a fraction of an inch. His superficial, luxury salesman brain was finally catching up, realizing that something was fundamentally, irreparably wrong with the ecosystem of this room. What? What are you doing? He whispered, his voice trembling violently in the quiet office. Why are you looking at me like that? We have to get out of here and call the Environmental Protection Agency. We have to prove to them that the proxy is completely revoked so we do not go to a federal penitentiary. I let out a very slow, profoundly calm sigh. There are no federal agents, Simon, I said, my voice cutting through the silent room like a sharpened pruning shear. The three men in the room froze as if they had been struck by an unseasonal frost. The corrupt real estate lawyer literally stopped breathing behind his glass desk. Arthur's jaw dropped open, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock. I looked right into Simon's terrified eyes, and I systematically uprooted his entire fabricated universe. There is no classified ecological mandate, I explained, keeping my tone incredibly flat and unwavering. There is no buried industrial pesticide leak. There is absolutely no $45 million environmental cleanup fine, and nobody is going to a federal penitentiary for 60 years. I harvested the entire crisis from thin air. Simon stopped breathing. He stared at me, utterly unable to process the staggering truth rolling off my tongue. I tapped the heavy legal folder containing the freshly signed revocation documents, securely tucked under my arm. I am a master winemaker, I told him, my voice dripping with profound disgust. Did you honestly, truly believe you could secretly forge my signature on an agricultural proxy, leverage my heritage estate for a $1,200,000 cash advance, wire the corporate money to an offshore account, and I would just stay in Italy and remain blissfully ignorant? I found the acquisition dossier right on your desk on Tuesday night. I saw the forged signatures. I traced the international banking route. Arthur started stammering uncontrollably. His face morphed into a violent, sickening shade of crimson. The realization of what I had just orchestrated slammed into his arrogant, speculative brain. He realized I had just legally tricked him into wiring over $1 million back to a multinational beverage conglomerate, paying an astronomical $110,000 wire penalty fee entirely out of his own depleted safety net, and willingly tearing up his own fraudulent land deed. He lunged forward, screaming like a wounded animal. He reached across the glass desk, desperately trying to snatch the heavy legal folder right out from under my arm. You set us up, Arthur roared, his voice cracking with undeniable helpless rage. You are a profoundly sick, twisted monster. That was a legally binding corporate acquisition. Give those proxy revocation papers back right this exact second. I easily stepped back, keeping entirely out of his frantic reach. No, I said quietly. It was a staggering, felony-level real estate crime. You forged legal land deeds. You committed massive grand larceny and wire fraud. And because you were in such a profoundly blind, terrifying panic over poisoned dirt, you just legally signed away every single shred of the multi-million-dollar terroir you thought you had stolen. I shifted my gaze directly to the deeply uncomfortable, sweating commercial lawyer. And if any of you attempt to fight me on this, I said, making absolutely certain the corrupt attorney heard my declaration, I possess high-resolution photographs of the originally forged proxy agreements. I have the offshore wire transfer routing numbers. I have the fraudulent notary stamps. I will take every single piece of undeniable evidence straight to the district attorney and the real federal authorities, and I will make absolutely sure that all three of you actually go to a federal penitentiary for real. Simon let out this agonizing, blood-curdling groan. He buried his face in his hands and collapsed forward onto the desk. He realized he had just legally confessed to a massive felony, lost a monumental corporate payday, and destroyed his entire 7-year marriage in one single, catastrophic evening. I looked down at his violently shaking silhouette. I am filing for divorce the exact second the civil courthouse opens on Monday morning, I told him. Do not bother returning to the farmhouse. Your bespoke designer suits and your expensive watches are already sitting in heavy black trash bags at the edge of the gravel driveway. And if you ever, even for a single passing second, try to come after my vineyard or my personal savings in the settlement, I will make the felony wire fraud charges officially binding. I did not wait for his pathetic apologies. I did not listen to Arthur's unhinged screaming. I turned on my heel, walked out of the sleazy office, got into my truck, and drove away into the cool, starlit valley. The legal and personal fallout over the following 8 months was undeniably brutal for my treacherous husband and his arrogant father, because I held the absolute concrete proof of their staggering felony forgery. Simon did not dare fight me in the divorce proceedings. He did not hire an aggressive family lawyer. He did not demand a single penny of my harvest revenue, and he absolutely did not try to claim any equity in the $8,500,000 estate. He signed the divorce papers quietly, absolutely terrified that I was going to send him to prison if he pushed back. He walked away from a remarkably comfortable, elegant life with absolutely nothing but the clothes in his garbage bags. Arthur's entire speculative life catastrophically imploded because he had frantically reversed the massive international wire transfer and drained his remaining liquidity to pay the $110,000 penalty fee. His creditors finally cornered him. He was forced to declare total devastating bankruptcy and lost everything he owned. I heard through mutual Valley acquaintances that they are both profoundly miserable. Because they lost the stolen corporate money and their finances collapsed, they turned on each other viciously. Simon blames Arthur for convincing him to steal the vineyard in the first place. Arthur blames Simon for completely caving under pressure and confessing to the fabricated environmental agents. They absolutely despise each other. Simon lost his luxury car sales job because the dealership caught wind of the scandal, and he had to move into a tiny, rundown apartment with his completely bankrupt father. They are currently working miserable, minimum-wage retail jobs just to keep the lights on. As for me, my life is undeniably a masterpiece. I kept my farmhouse and my pristine 75-acre vineyard. The harvest this year was spectacular, yielding one of the most highly rated vintages our valley has ever seen. I am surrounded by beautiful vines, profound history, and genuine peace, entirely free from parasitic, greedy opportunists. I learned a staggering, invaluable lesson. The absolute most effective way to completely destroy an arrogant, entitled thief is not to scream at them or try to appeal to their non-existent morality. The greatest method is to weaponize their own suffocating terror. Step entirely out of the way and watch them legally, frantically, uproot their own existence.